Now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Marco, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. This is Dr. Meng Gu. I'm an associate professor, extension specialist in the Department of Horticultural Sciences at the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. And today you are invited to the first of the 2018 Spring Quick Bite webinar series, and it's co-sponsored by Southern Risk Management Education Center, EarthKind, our program here, and also Texas Nursery and Landscape Association. And today the webinar will highlight the connection between the neurobiological roots of human behavior and purchasing decisions. And it will a brief introduction will present advances in neuroeconomics and how it was involved to create new fields such as consumer neurosciences and stuff. And I think it has a lot of implication and a lot of application in the green industry. And our speaker today is the best, Dr. Marco Palmer. He is faculty in the Department of Agriculture Economics. He got his education from University of Florida, and he has just been doing a lot of these activities. And Marco, you're the head of this human behavior lab, right?
Yes, the director.
Okay, the director. Yes, yeah. And I just want to remind you that we are going to be putting more webinars in this blog. It's called greenbeyond.wordpress.com. And at the end of the webinar, the recorded webinar, the link to the recorded webinar will be made available at this web page. So I would encourage you to put it down on your on a piece of paper, just to put it somewhere, so in the future that you could come back. You could always come back to review these webinars. And plus, on this web page, we have probably 30 plus, probably 40 webinars related to all areas of the green industry. Just come on and have a feast. This is the GoToWebinar panel. This may be a little old, and right here, this button here, you can open and close the panel, and then you could type in your question here, in this question panel, and then all the questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Since we're going to be doing the recording, so we want the presenter to have a smooth flow during the presentation. But we'll make sure that we answer most, if not all, the questions, based on the time. And we have some of the future webinars coming up. I will be hosting this one on May the 16th. Dr. Jared Barnes from Stephen F. Austin State University, and he's going to talk about engaging the younger audience. And also TNLA will be hosting a series, the financial series, and as listed here. So make sure that check back and enjoy all these webinars. With that, I'm going to change the presenter to Dr. Marco Palmer. Dr. Palmer, now you have the
Right.
Yes, you have the screen. Go ahead.
So I'm going to start by showing a little video introduction of the Human Behavior Laboratory here at Texas A&M, and that
Science and technology is solving the mysteries of human behavior. Biometric researchers are working to understand, predict, and eventually change behaviors. Acquiring and interpreting data for this level of research has been costly and time-consuming until now. Texas A&M's Human Behavior Lab is on the forefront of biometric research. In the lab and in real-life application, we are pushing the boundaries of science even further. Researchers are unveiling the emotional and physical responses that drive our decisions. We are ready for the future. The lab has a new program that can now measure across vectors and release a composite finding. What does this mean for other researchers, for the tech industry, for marketers. We are partnering with academic and industry leaders across the globe to discover how and why we make choices. Together, we will unlock the benefits for your market, your sector, and our shared future.
Well, with that introduction, I would like to thank Dr. Gu for her very kind introduction. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how these advances in measuring biometrics and other ways of looking at human behavior can really help us understand the consumer and how can we use this information to make better business decisions. In many cases, as human beings, we make decisions, but we are not completely sure how those decisions have evolved. There are many factors that surround our decision making that even subtle changes have a big and profound impact in the choices that we make. And so I hope that today I'm going to be able to at least point out to 2 or 3 things that you can take away maybe as business strategies. And I'm going to do that by giving a little overview of the field of neuroeconomics and neuromarketing and how the field can inform us about human behavior. So when we look at the traditional view of economic decision making, we have always had this idea in economics that human beings are these rational agents that make decisions based on perfect information, and that every time information changes, we see that there is an update in our preferences, and so that.
Dr. Marco, can you do a full screen?
Yeah, this is in my other. The full screen is in my other monitor, so let me see if I can just switch it here. Otherwise, we can just leave it.
That's fine. If
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's continue.
Okay. So as I was saying, we have this view of the rational economic decision making. Well, in reality, consumers have very little time to make their decisions about what to buy, where to eat, and how to interact with their surroundings, whether that's in a purchasing situation or whether that's related to something else. There is very little information that has a big impact in how we make the decisions. So the traditional view has been more like Spock in Star Trek, in which the consumer carefully evaluates the benefits of taking an action or making a purchase or taking a decision and the cost of that decision. And a consumer or a person will only act when the benefits are higher than the cost of making that particular decision. In reality, we know that we as human beings very seldom make that comparison. If that was the case, we will have perfect allocation of the resources that we spend today versus the amount of money that we save into the future. And we will make a perfect allocation, and we won't have any issues related to not having enough money for retirement. We'll also carefully plan our meals to ensure that we will maintain a perfect weight and that we will not either be gaining or losing weight. And we will make so many different decisions in our environment that will be absolutely optimal. Well, in reality, we know that we as human beings, it's a very difficult process for us to actually make those optimal decisions, in many cases because we do not have perfect information. Now, what is it that we can do as business managers and owners to try to highlight some of the products? But the first thing is that we need to make sure that we understand that the time consumers devote to make decisions is very, very small. And so the more that we can make to simplify the messages, the better. On average, most of the experiments that we have conducted show that consumers spend at most a couple of seconds looking at a product. And so the attention span is very short, and you have a very small window to capture the attention of the consumer. So how can you do that? Well, make simplified messages that everybody would be able to understand. There are many parts of the brain that are important for decision making, and I'm not going to go through them because that would be just beyond this talk. But the important thing that we need to understand is that the frontal lobe is a very important part when it comes to human decision making. That's really what separates us from other intelligent animals. It's really what makes the circuitry of us to make the decisions. And this part has evolved throughout time to adapt to different environments. And so in certain cases, we can go back to evolutionary biology and look at how we used to process, for example, sugars. And our livelihoods depended on us being able to find and store the sugars that the body needed because we didn't have an abundant supply of food. And so the brain processed the sugar as in a similar way as processing different types of drugs, the similar pathways. Now, we no longer have to rely on that hunting and gathering to procure our food, but now the circuitry of the brain is very still similar in that path. And so in a way, we have these microbiological uh, um, uh, parts of the brain that really are designed to have that rush and to provide a very strong attachment to sugar. Even babies who have never tasted sugar experience this process in the brain. And so this is what I want to mention, maybe a couple of points talking about some of the things that we can relate to decision making, but from a point that we need to understand some of the neurobiological roots of decision making. So the first experiments that are very interesting and appealing to us as in terms of consumer neuroscience were in the late 70s and early 80s by Benjamin Libet. And this clock that you see here has become known as the Libet clock. And this Libet clock, essentially the dot moves around, and he asked participants to do one simple task. They had to be able to move either the left index finger or the right index finger. Now, in doing so, they can move the finger whenever they wanted to, and then the the task actually was very, very interesting because what happened was there was a lag of a little bit over a half a second, specifically 550 milliseconds between the activity in the brain and the actual movement of the finger. So for the first time in history, we had the question, when do we really decide? Is it when we actually move the finger and made the action of moving that finger? Or was it when the brain activation started that eventually will result in us moving the finger? And so it's in this time difference that we find most of the studies being interested in looking at the functional parts of the brain and how they affect our behavior. Now, if you look at the experiments related to purchasing decisions, one of the early studies was by Knudsen et al. And this study essentially show pictures of different things. In this case, I'm showcasing here a picture of a Godiva chocolate, and there were certain parts of the experiment that were supposed to highlight different things. So in the first stage, we see the product itself. There's nothing else, so it's a way to try to highlight the benefits of consuming that particular product. Now, the second one shows not only the product, but it also shows the price of the product, the actual monetary cost. And the third part shows whether the person is going to decide whether to purchase the product or not at that particular price. So what we see here was that there are different parts of the brain that activate depending on what are we seeing in terms of the purchasing a product. The medial parts of the brain, like the nucleus accumbens and the ventral striata, tend to activate a lot more when we're in the presence of the benefits of the product. Now, the insula is another part of the brain that activates when we look at the cost, and the decision-making process actually happens in the medial prefrontal cortex. So I saw an ad once in an airport that I think provides a very good and intuitive way of thinking about this. And the ad said it was about a watch, and it said something like, my brain is telling me no, but my heart is telling me, why not? Why shouldn't I buy this beautiful, beautiful watch? And so I think that in thinking about this, it's as if we have 2 or 3 different systems that are continuously competing in terms of how much do we process the benefits and the costs, and how much do we value and what decision we end up doing as to whether we're going to buy the product or not. And so this is very interesting because um, what we see in this case is that the different parts of the brain drive us to do something else. So as marketeers, what we need to ask ourselves is, how can we emphasize the benefits of different products? How can we make the message simple so that consumers are able to process that and minimize the cost? Remember that when we think about marketing, we think about providing value to consumers, and that value is reflected in the benefits, or having high benefits divided by the cost, which means that the more the benefits, the higher the value, and the higher the cost, the lower the value. Now, when we talk about cost in this case, we're talking about the monetary cost, but we can also think about the transaction cost of an action. So how difficult it is for our consumers to find us and to process the information that they see in our products. And this is very important, but when it comes to making decisions about what to buy and when to buy it, we as human beings are very present biased. In other words, we have this myopic view of the world, and we always care about today a lot more than we care about the future. And this is not really necessarily our fault, because there are different parts of the brain, again, that drive us to make that choice between selecting something today and then worrying about the future later. And so in doing that, that's something very important, because it essentially teaches that consumers are very impatient and they want everything now, and that now is better than in the future. And there are some microbiological reasons for why consumers have this present bias, or this wanting to get everything right away. And so I think that the business world has adapted, and we see more and more efficiency in terms of providing the products in a very timely fashion. Now, one important thing that we need to talk about is, how do consumers actually react to branding and prestige of the products? And there are some experiments that gives us very interesting insights as to why branding and the prestige of the products are very important in many different scenarios, not only just in agriculture, because I think that we have gone through the process of branding different fruit products for many years, and the green industry or the ornamental industry is starting to do a lot more branding these days. And I think that's something that will probably continue to increase in that trend. So this very simple experiment, participants were asked to rate the friendliness of a person who was a Confederate. So it was a person that was part of the experiment, and this individual was providing support as a salesperson to the people participating in the experiment. So in one of the conditions, the person was wearing a black jacket like the one you see on your left, and in the other condition, the person was wearing the exact same color of the shirt, except that he had a branded shirt. After the experiment, they asked participants to rate the knowledge, the friendliness, how helpful the person was, and even to assign what they thought was a fair wage for that person. Now remember, this was the exact same individual doing the exact same task, only with 2 different shirts. And what was interesting is that the person who was wearing the branded shirt had much better reviews. The person was much friendly, has more knowledge. It was a lot more efficient in showing the products, to the point that the wages reported for the person who was wearing the branded shirt, which were much higher than when the person was wearing the blank non-branded shirt. Now, this is important and is interesting, and I think that many industries have used this information before. And if you look at financial planners, if you look at different industries that use the clothing as part of their identity, and that make that identity prime people to think, well, this person is successful. So if I am to trust my life savings for retirement to somebody, I want to make sure that I trust somebody who is successful. And this is the idea behind why we see these industries making sure that they portray that success. The same is true for industries like real estate and other related industries. Now, when we think about this branding, I think it's very interesting because on the one hand, we are used to thinking about quality and price being very highly correlated. And essentially what I mean by that is that everything else being equal, the price of something being higher signals a higher quality. Things that are more expensive usually are of better quality, usually. And so as consumers, we have been educated from the time we were kids that the more expensive something is, the more or the higher the quality. This is interesting because in the food industries and in agriculture in general, this is not necessarily the case, because when there is a problem, for example, with a disease or maybe a pest, or there was a hurricane and the supply is low, normally what happens is that we see a reduction in the supply, and the products that are in the market might not necessarily be as high quality as when we have an oversupply of the products. And so the price, actually, when the supply is really high, you have a lot of products to choose from, and they tend to be very high quality. But when there's a shock in supply because of a disease, then we have a reduction in supply, which actually ends up increasing the price, and the quality of the product is not necessarily higher. So from a consumer standpoint, it's very difficult for them to process this big change in agricultural products, because that's not the way they're used to process this quality and price relationship. Now, this experiment, it's very remarkable, because what they did in this experiment was to show people two different wines. One bottle of wine that was priced at $90, and the other bottle of wine that was priced at $10. Now, the caveat here it was that it was the exact same bottle of wine. Even though I have one picture here in a green label and the other one in the blue label, they were exactly the same. The labels were identical. The only reason I have the two colors is so that you can see what happened to the two bottles of wine. And so they were identical in every aspect except for the price. So what happened was fascinating, because people reported the $90 bottle of wine to have better taste, and it won all the tasting contests. And up to that point, that was interesting. But what they did after that was that they actually look at the brain of the participants while they were drinking the wine. And the group who was doing that was a group of wine connoisseurs, where people that normally drink wine and they're supposed to be familiar with the quality of wine, good judges of wine. So what happened was that when they look at the ratings and everything else, they were much higher with the $90 bottle of wine, which is interesting. But then again, they look at what happened in the brain. And what happened in the brain was fascinating, because it showed that when people drank the $90 bottle of wine, the medial orbit of frontal cortex, which is the area of the brain that processes the pleasantness of smells and odors and taste, activated a lot more with the $90 bottle of wine compared to the $10 bottle of wine. Now, this is fascinating because it shows that we as human beings are microbiologically wired to derive pleasure from consuming things that we perceive to have prestige, or that have this branding component. And so we have the circuitry in the brain that actually processes and gives a lot more satisfaction, or what we call in economics, utility of consuming products that are prestigious. This is what Thorstein Veblen, a long time ago, termed conspicuous consumption. That's the consumption of products because of the added prestige that they have. And his idea was that we as human beings, in order to gain and hold the esteem of men, is not sufficient to merely possess wealth and power, because this wealth and power has to be put in evidence. So what he's saying here is that it's not only about having the wealth and the power, but you have to be able to show it. So we might not necessarily observe the income of people when we walk through the streets, but we observe how they dress, we observe what car they drive, we observe many things that gives us a proxy of how prestigious that person is, or the wealth or the power of that individual. And so that's really what opens the door for consumption of brands and products from individuals. And the main two motivations of these are either to do a pecuniary emulation or to try to be perceived as an individual who belongs to a higher class by consuming this brand or a prestigious product, or by an invidious comparison, which essentially say you have the income to buy these prestigious products and then you use that income to buy the products. Now, there is some evidence that this happens not only with luxury goods, but also in non-luxury markets. And we've done studies in which we show that there is a segment of consumers who, even in agriculture and food and products that are relatively inexpensive, are always looking to buy these brands or products that are perceived to be conspicuous. In the case of food, for example, there's a segment of consumers that consumes organic products and other type of differentiated products because of the prestige associated with these products, because they tend to be more expensive, and also because they're good to the environment. They're good to pro-social. They have these pro-social components of for example, contributing to education or contributing to the development of different parts of agriculture. And they also showcase that the person has this restraint to live healthy and to have better lifestyles. Now, the brands itself, you might be asking yourself, how is it possible that some brands actually make it all the way, but there's some brands that never really take off? Why does that happen? Well, there's one thing in the market for food and agriculture that is different today than many years ago, and that is that in order for conspicuous consumption to exist, this consumption has to be broadcasted. It has to be shown to others. Now, what we have today that allow consumers to do that is social media, and now we see a lot more people interested in the origin of food and taking pictures of their food and posting those online, because that's a way of providing that message to others that, number one, I'm eating healthy. Number two, I'm eating products that are branded, have higher prices. And so this is a way of showcasing that. We also see people using social media to showcase, for example, exercising routes, which showcases that the person is very active physically and they have an exercise routine and so on. So I think that from that standpoint, we want to make a similar movement to see people being healthy and wealthy in conserving their gardens and being good to the earth and so on. But this is something that is important because this social component of other people seeing what we consume and validating that consumption is something that is not new. And this is, in this classic experiment, what Ash did was essentially line up a group of people and ask them, you see the line here labeled as line 1, which of the other 3 lines, A, B, or C, is closer in length to line 1? And obviously, when people were lined up and simply stating the answer, everybody will say B. And there were less than 1% errors. But then what he did is he hired some confederate, some stooges, and these stooges would stand in line in front of the actual participant. And they would very confidently say, for example, A. Oh, it's clearly line A. It's line A. It's line A. And by the time people actually went and had to state the line, there were almost 37% errors. What that means essentially is that we as human beings are willing to incur in a cost, the cost of being wrong, so that we have that social validation. It's important for us to have that sense of belonging into some social circle. And this is the root as to why people look actively and seek different brands so that they can have this social validation. And of course, in processing all of these messages and the brands, when you go into the marketplace, there is a plethora of brands. And so how do consumers actually choose? We have to be very careful about that, because as marketeers, we know that having a lot of different products is something that is good, that consumers enjoy. And we have increased the number of products in the marketplace, whether it's talking about food or talking about green industry products. There are many products to choose from that in some cases we know, we understand from economic theory that more is better than less, but in some cases this creates some confusion. There are so many alternatives, that it creates what Iyengar and Lepper term choice overload, or this inability to choose because you have too many options. So think about the last time you were trying to look for a movie in Netflix. And how many of us look and browse through the titles and think, oh my God, there's nothing here in Netflix. I do not find a movie. This is incredible. How can that be possible? I mean, we're talking about thousands and thousands of movie titles, and even the algorithms that show us what are the things that we might like based on what we have seen before and liked. And yet we seem to not be able to find something that we truly say, oh, this is great. And I think it's because this choice overload. We have too many options to choose from that results in an inability to choose, and it really hurts that. And the same happens in a business environment. And so in this experiment, what Iyengar and Lepper did is they had two different situations. In one case, they brought people into a grocery store and set up a tasting booth. And in the tasting booth, they displayed 6 different flavors of jams. They took out strawberry and blueberry and some of the main flavors, but they had 6 different flavors. And then they gave people a coupon so they could go to the jam section and choose any jam they wanted to buy at a discount. Now they repeated the exact same experiment, but only with the difference that instead of displaying 6 flavors, they displayed 24 flavors. What happened was fascinating because obviously when there were more flavors, that generated a lot more interest, and it's pictured here by showing that a lot more people will stop by to taste the jams and to interact with the tasting booth. But when it came to sales, the sales were actually lower than when there were less jams. And so there is some evidence in the field that this happens. Now we have seen this concept increasing, and we see now restaurants or different food industries that are using this concept and reducing the amount of choices that people get. In some cases, you get a reduced number of choices that are very much prepared by a chef, they're gourmet style. And what happens is that individuals actually get out of this experience a lot more satisfied. They like the food a lot more. They enjoy the environment a lot more. And in many cases, they pay even very much higher prices to have less options. And it has something to do with the fact that we as human beings have this loss aversion. We do not like to lose. And so if we have way too many choices, we we rationalize that by saying, well, I'm going to try to make the right choice. But if I have so many options, I might actually regret later not choosing something that was better than what I chose. And so these having this plethora of options actually might result in an ability to choose because we have the fear of not being able to choose the right alternative. Now, this is very important because we have been trained as marketeers and as business owners to try to make as many products available as possible. And so we have the risk of losing the concentration and the focus of our business, which might be in 1 or 2 products that might be the most successful products. So this is a very thin line with a trade-off between how many products do we want to increase and how that changes the profitability and what is required from us from a managing standpoint to be able to keep up with this diversity of products and understanding how these diversity of products are actually affecting the bottom line profitability in our business. And so the recommendation I would make here is for a careful analysis of the cost and the benefits of different lines and trying to concentrate in those products that actually make our bottom line happen. After all, people are very busy and they want everything now, not later. And when they are making choices, they might be preoccupied with things that happen in their lives. And so this experiment I'm showing now was fascinating because it showed that when poor individuals were thinking about finances, their cognitive function was compromised. In other words, they were so preoccupied by thinking about how am I going to make ends meet? How am I going to face a financial challenge if I had a financial situation? And by being concentrated so much in that, people do not realize other actions in the periphery that might be affected. And so this is what happens, for example, when we're too stressed out and we have a very limited attention for multitasking as human beings. And when we're thinking and focusing and narrowing our feelings and our thoughts into something, our decision making in other areas of our lives are affected. And so we might not realize that we're eating a lot more than we're supposed to because we're busy thinking about something else. And this is fairly important for us because this multitasking, it's something that consumers are not able to do. So we have to make it simple for them to choose. And for example, here I have a slide in which I'm going to show you a video. And in this video, the task of the participants, so if you want to follow through in this video, the task is very simple. You have to count the number of times that the girls in the green shirt jump over the rope. So if there are two girls jumping at the same time, that counts as two different jumps. Now the question here would be, can the webinar participants count? And so in doing that, I'm going to be asking you to count that number of times that the girls jump. Because we are very bad as beings in multitasking, it's very likely that if you got the number right, which I think it was 42 jumps, that you actually missed some things happen in the environment around it. And so there was a giant chicken in the back, and if you actually got the number right, you probably missed that information. There's also a change in the color in the background. And we also ask individuals if they showed the big gorilla that was walking in the back. Nearly almost 3% of the people report seeing that gorilla, even though there is no gorilla in the back. And so we have this tendency of having this misreporting. And when we conduct marketing and survey experiments to try to anticipate demand, we rely on these surveys. So the value of all this biometric equipment when we look into the brain and eye tracking and other measures is to try to understand why is actually happening. So in this case, what I'm going to show you is the big circle that appears there is an eye tracking device, which essentially points to the visual attention of the person participating. And what you see below is the activity in the prefrontal cortex or in the frontal lobe of the participant. And what you will be able to see here is that when the person is counting, that's going to show as a big jump in the activity in the brain, but now the person is not really counting. The participant is not even looking at the feet. Here's your chicken in the back if you missed it. Now, the person is not really counting. So it's not that the person cannot count, it's that human beings are very easily distracted. And this is a perfect way for us to show that is the case. Now, when the person starts counting again, we see that the activity in the brain starts to rise again. And so we can complement what we see in our survey data with what the consumers actually do. And by pairing the information that we look into their visual attention with what happens in the brain, that gives us more refined models to understand human decision making and purchasing. So in many cases, I guess one of the messages I want to deliver to you is that we might want to be able to accomplish some things, and consumers might want to go into the stores and have in mind different products. But in many cases, it's the brain and the brain biology that actually activates different areas based on different stimuli. And marketeers obviously have known this for many, many times. So, but not everything is lost. There's certain type of commitment devices that can be used to try to improve our decisions. And the oldest one of them all appears in Homer's Odyssey. And if you remember Ulysses or Odysseus, he wanted to go see the sirens, but these sirens were like the ancient times divas of today. And the problem was that as you get close to them, there were many dangers, and eventually the boats would crash and everybody would die. So he devised this plan in which he asked his crew to tie him into the mast and to put beeswax in their ears so that they wouldn't hear the singing, and that he would be able to hear and see the singing, but he would be tied. And he asked them, no matter what I do, please do not untie me. So this is what's really commitment devices, and those are being used today a lot more to try to improve our achieving goals. So one of them is simply setting a deadline increases the likelihood that you will actually complete a task. Um, there is another one in which if people want to save money, for example, for retirement, they can pre-commit to save something they don't currently have. So for example, you're living in a state in which you're using a certain amount of money, so you can commit to say, whatever I get in a raise next year, that's how much I'm going to save. Because technically, if you're living with an amount of money, you can live with that same amount, providing that the cost of inflation is not really that high, but you can commit to that money that you still haven't received. So these commitment devices work in many different areas. You can see here this company that is very clever in designing. This is a safe that does not open until a certain amount of time has passed. And so we can see here how we can improve our trying to control our snacking or maybe our playing time. Maybe if we have a little bit too much to drink, we can wait and prevent accidents, shopping, etc. And so there are many ways in which we are able to use these commitment devices that might be interesting way to provide consumers with a way of knowing exactly what they want. So for example, provide them with information about previous purchases and getting the feedback from them to understand what really likes them and be able to provide those same products is a way of doing that. Now, one of the last things I want to talk about is episodic prospection. And what this means is that we make people think about the future to change the choices that they do today. And so this goes all the way back to Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol. Remember that when Ebenezer Scrooge is visited by the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future, when he's visited by the ghost of Christmas past and present, he gets melancholic, sad, but he doesn't really change his behavior. It's not until the ghost of Christmas yet to come visits that he actually changes his behavior. And so this is important because I think that this episodic prospection or imagining the future actually tends to change the behavior of people today. And so if you think about ways in which you can incorporate this into your business, it's easy. So you can show, for example, plants and see how they would grow eventually, and so that people can actually picture themselves in their backyard, in their environment with the plants when they're fully grown, and they can anticipate the benefits of something that will take a few years to appear, but you can actually make that connection easier, and that will improve sales and the way in which people feel with those products in terms of the connection with those products. So everything about it is about communicating those benefits and trying to reduce the action of those costs. Whatever it is, social responsibility, environmental responsibility, anything that communicates a benefit that goes beyond the product itself, but it's giving something additional or extra that goes beyond the product is something that is fair game. And so in our lab, we're trying to look at different behaviors and trying to predict what people are going to do. And it turns out we can predict just by looking at the brain. We're very accurate, up to 83%, almost 84% probability to predict whether a person will actually end up buying a product or not in different settings in which the products are making real purchasing decisions. So these experiments are not just necessarily lab experiments where people are making decisions that are hypothetical. They're actually making real purchasing and real decisions. And whether it's one product or maybe choosing between competing products or in real environments, in many cases, we as growers or as even as academic researchers, we are obsessed with having the perfect product. But is that what the consumer really wants? Because we have the notions of what we think is the highest quality, best product available out there. Is that what the consumer wants? And what are the trade-offs between having the perfect product and the price? Do they match or not? And so these are questions that I think that neuromarketing can help us to improve in the years to come. So with that, I'm going to open the floor for questions, and I'm going to go back to Dr. Wu and see if we have any questions in the box.
Well, thank you, Dr. Palmer. That was a great presentation. And now we'll just open it to the audience. I apologize about the background noise. Just if you have any questions, please type it in the question box.